the fact that the Germans had lost air superiority before D-Day even, that situation would have been completely reversed and they would have regained air superiority. And who knows what would have happened to the campaign in the West. They could have seen the Allies thrown back into the sea.
We're talking about 6 battleships that start at 56,000 tons, which is much heavier than the Bismarck, 8 16-inch guns, rising to the last one, which is 132,000 tons, which is bigger than any ship we have in the world today.
Well, I met the author of the famous Das Boot, and he said to me, without question, that they thought that they were on board a war-winning weapon, that the U-boats could actually do it. But Hitler famously said that he was a hero on land and a coward at sea.
You're right, he likes big stuff.
Yeah.
And you look at some of the aircraft, which we'll talk about later. I mean, 6-engine, big aircraft. And so, yeah, for some reason, there is a size issue associated with Hitler.
Yes, definitely.
And Freud, of course, is Austrian as well. So.
Wars are not just won on the battlefield. They take resources, industry and productivity, 3 areas where Germany ultimately fell short in its aims for the Second World War. And yet the technological ambitions of Nazi Germany far outpaced its wartime capabilities. From the world's first jet-powered fighter to ballistic missiles, from colossal tanks to advanced submarines, Adolf Hitler's regime was able to develop a series of revolutionary wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons. Ultimately, it all came too late in the day to turn the tide of the war. But what if that timeline had shifted? Could the wonder weapons have helped the Nazis to win World War II? I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today we're discussing Adolf Hitler's wonder weapons, a series of remarkable advances in military engineering, but ones which were unable to make a decisive impact on the Second World War. Yet had the wonder weapons been ready sooner, could they have led to defeat for the Allies? These are questions for our experts, and joining me as ever is the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel once again is the historian and journalist Nigel Jones. Welcome to you both. Now we have in front of us one of our favourite maps, our big map of continental Europe as it would have been during the Second World War. I suppose to start off, Chris Parry, to start with you, in 1944 when some of the wonder weapons actually do start coming into service, things are not going well for the Nazis at this point.
No, they're not. And I think part of the story of this is that quite a lot of these technical programs are conceptualized in the 1930s. And Hitler is telling everybody, look, we're not going to go to war until about 1941, 1942. It's only as 1938 unfolds that he tells his military leaders, actually, we're going to go pretty soon. Czechoslovakia, Poland, then start. And Admiral Raeder, in particular, in the Navy, is shocked because he's got a Z plan for lots of new shiny warships. They're going to come into play probably from about 1944-45 onwards. So essentially, Hitler has handicapped in many ways some of these technical advances, which, as I say, are just conceptualized at the start of the war, but don't actually have time to pick up speed and get into service by the time he needs them. And as you say, quite a lot of these weapons are introduced in 1944 when the Germans, of course, have lost in North Africa. They're fighting really to stay in Italy, barely doing that. D-Day has happened, and they become what the Germans call revenge rather than war-winning weapons.
Well, I mean, for example, the V1 and the V2, the V stands for vengeance.
It does, yeah. And we mustn't forget, there's actually a V3, which is basically a rocket propellant-assisted artillery gun that fires at 105 miles. So there was a V3 as well.
Yeah, we will get into some of the weapons themselves in due course. Nigel, always a pleasure. Welcome back to History Undone. I suppose one of the crucial things is that if in 1944 you're Adolf Hitler, the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons, are almost your last big hope. And indeed, you know, Goebbels was going into overdrive, using them as a propaganda tool as well.
Very much so. Goebbels promised, as we know, total war and was in favour of everything in Germany, all its industrial capacity being dedicated to these projects. And they I think, invested too much hope, for example, in the V1 and V2s. They really thought, against all the evidence, that this would bring England to its knees again if they rained these bombs down on London and southeast England. And it just didn't happen that way. But it was, as you say, a forlorn hope, as it turned out, and thank God for that.
And how worried are the Allies at this point about the German wunderwaffe?
Extremely worried, because there was nothing like the V2s, especially, not so much the V1s, the flying bombs. The V2s were a totally new development in warfare. And when these huge explosions came in London, seemingly out of a clear blue sky, and they found out that these were coming from sites that had to be taken by the advancing Allied forces in Europe, they were worried. There was a race against time, of course, overrunning the V2 launch sites before too many of them landed on London and around. So it was an extremely worrying thing after D-Day, when they thought after D-Day, well, you know, it's all over by the shouting now, and it wasn't.
I mean, it's quite important. The range of the V2 is about 220 miles, the V1 about 150 miles. And so the effectiveness of the weapons is basically blunted by us overtaking the launch sites and where they can be launched from. And of course, that's a critical driver of where you actually put your armies on the continent. Yeah. So all those sites in the Netherlands and Western Germany are real priorities for the British in particular.
Nigel, why are the Nazis so far ahead, or it would seem at this point, in this kind of arms race?
Well, the Nazis generally were a very progressive, in industrial ways, force. I mean, most of the Nazi leaders, compared to other European politicians, were very young, were very technically forward-looking. Hitler himself was very keen on, as we know, he had a hand in designing automobiles, for example, and he was a micromanager and really, really was keen on new developments in technology, very keen on Wernher von Braun's programs of rockets. So I think he wanted to develop these things, and they probably went ahead on too many fronts. If they concentrated on just one or two of the weapons and put all the resources into that, they might have had more success.
You mentioned Wernher von Braun. I mean, we should say there were some incredibly gifted scientists working for the Germans on this, not just Wernher von Braun, Heisenberg famously.
Yeah, I mean, there are at least 20 rocket programs going on in the 30s that eventually result in the V2. And this is an astonishing advance for that period. Nobody else is thinking about ballistic missiles at this stage. And so they're right out in front conceptually and in terms of design. Yeah. And as Nigel says, it's quite right that they are actually spurring innovation on such a broad front that nobody knows where to put the investment. It's not just financial investment, of course, it's raw materials, particularly steel, but also every other technical aspect is being taken in here. The astonishing thing is, in the last year of the war, German productivity was greater than it was at any other stage in the war. So under incessant bombing, Speer in particular had organised industry and the slave labour associated with it to actually produce quite a lot of these wonder weapons. In fact, the V2 cost an enormous number of lives to build. But the Germans are even smart then. They saw that the Allied air forces were looking for the launch sites for V1s and V2s, so they transferred the production underground.
Underground, yeah.
And so you can see them being very agile in terms of what they're doing here under tremendous pressure. Despite all the Admiral aspects, of course, this is built on slave labour and of course total war and all that brings with it.
You've already mentioned the V1s and the V2s. Let's get into some of the specific weapons now. They covered obviously land, sea and air. If we begin on land, Nigel, do you want to tell us about some of the land-based Wunderwaffe?
Yeah, well, I heard last night, quite interestingly, a professor of AI was giving a lecture, and he mentioned that, for example, the super tank in the latter part of the war, the super Nazi tank, the Tiger, was inherently inferior to the much cruder battle tank of the Soviets, the T-34, their main battle tank, because although it was heavy and packed a huge punch with its 88 gun, it was full of moving parts. It was like a tank designed by a committee. And above all, it had to take 1 day out of 7, a day of rest, to be totally refueled and re-maintained. And so, in a way, it was a wonder weapon that backfired on the Germans.
But there are a couple of others in the wings. There's one called the Mouse. which is a tank. It is 200 tons. You imagine that. It's got a 128 millimeter gun. It's got a crew of 6 and can actually engage targets at 3,500 meters. So that was basically around. There was an even bigger one, a real battle wagon, 1,000 tons. That they planned to put into, and that was going to have basically 280 millimeter guns and 128 millimeter. It had a crew of between 26 and 41. Now that's the size basically of a small destroyer, and they were going to put that. The only snag was it could only do 14 miles an hour. It was 38 metres long, though. So,
do you think, Chris, this had anything to do with Hitler's mania for giganticism?
Yeah, absolutely.
Gigantic buildings.
There's no question about that.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the super guns that they built, there's one called the Heavy Gustav, for example, which is a huge gun, a railway gun, that is used against Sevastopol. We're talking about a 21-inch gun here. I mean, it's huge by any standards.
This is like Big Bertha in the First World War, or indeed the German tanks in the First World War had much bigger crews than the Allied tanks, and they had a mania for size.
Had a mate called Dora, but they used Gustav to actually fight against the Russians at Sevastopol, and it penetrated a magazine that was 98 feet underground. So you're right, he likes big stuff.
Yeah.
And you look at some of the aircraft, which we'll talk about later. I mean, 6-engine, big aircraft, and so for some reason there is a size issue associated with Hitler.
Yes,
and Freud, of course, is Austrian as well.
So Nigel, where would Hitler use these tanks if he had his way? Where on this map would he deploy them?
Well,
not across rivers, that's for sure.
No, the Tigers did feature in the Normandy campaign. There was an ace called Wittmann who destroyed Shermans by quite, that was his big thing, and they were a worry for the Allies in the Normandy campaign. But in fact, because of their size, nature, they did not prove as effective as the Nazis hoped and as the Allies feared.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nigel's right. I mean, the real problem with quite a lot of the material at the end of the war is that the metallurgy wasn't quite right because they were mixing up compound materials because they couldn't get the iron and steel. You'll find some of the design was rushed, and as you said earlier, Nigel, the integration of quite a lot of the systems was poor. We can talk about that. And the fact they were rushed into service meant that there wasn't any through-life support, which is something you look for. So you had maintainers all going, well, I've never seen this before. How does that work? And in many cases, you saw the same type of vehicle, particularly armoured vehicle, looking different to others. So the configuration wasn't right. Now, in many of the later tanks, they got heavier, but also the engines were very underpowered. That was the thing. And I mean, there's one later called the ball tank, which was a reconnaissance vehicle shaped like a ball with 2 rotary sort of tracks, but it was powered by a motorcycle engine. So this thing rolled along. It was quite heavily armoured, and you sat inside it. But that's the sort of thing that they were doing. But you look at some of these tanks, and you look at the Maybach engines in particular, they are underpowered. So heavier tank, underpowered, slower, using an awful lot of fuel as well, which they don't have a lot of fuel at this stage.
And Nigel, is a recurring theme with the Wunderwaffe that the effort that was going into them ended up denuding the wider German war effort?
I think that's right, yes. I think they got bedazzled by the possibilities that they could produce these weapons that would bring Britain in particular to its knees, and then later the Soviet Union. And they just wasted, as Chris said, too much of their precious resources. And we shouldn't forget that Nazi Germany was very short of resources. I mean, the whole of the Russian campaign in the middle stages was dictated by the drive to go to the Caucasus and get the oil there, because they were desperate for oil. And I just think they were they bit off literally more than they could chew.
OK, let's talk about the wonder weapons available for sea. As a naval man, Chris, do you want to talk us through these?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to Grand Admiral Rader's Z-plan. So we're talking about aircraft carriers, and in fact, the Germans built an aircraft carrier called the Graf Zeppelin, and it sat alongside for the whole of the war. It had 3 sister ships that were going to be built, including a very large one indeed. That would have carried 42 aircraft. They never got that program off the ground. Why? Because of rivalry with Goering, who said, well, if it flies, it's mine. And he basically didn't let the Navy have the sort of aircraft it needed. But they always thought they needed those aircraft carriers. Then you've got Bismarck and Tirpitz, of course, but you think they're big. Yeah. We then get into the H program, and we're talking about 6 battleships that start at 56,000 tons, which is much heavier than the Bismarck, 8 16-inch guns, rising to the last one, which is 132,000 tons, which is bigger than any ship we have in the world today, bigger than the supercarriers.
So that wouldn't have just been the biggest battleship of the time, that would have been the biggest battleship of all time.
Biggest warship ever, even up till today.
Wow.
And that was going to have 8 20-inch guns. So if you think about the Japanese super battleships, they had 18-inch guns. These were going to have 20-inch guns, 8 of them. Again, you're back to your point, Nigel, about size.
And literally white elephants, because I mean, the
resource... They laid the keel of 2 of them, but it never happened. But just think about the scale of that, 132,000 tons.
But is that almost too big?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the trouble they went to protecting the Tirpitz itself more than outweighed any possible use that the Tirpitz could have come to them. And and we all know what happened when the Bismarck went on its first and last war voyage. And I just think, yet again, they are devoting resources to the wrong things.
You see, what's happening is they're not saying, what is the environment in which we want these technologies to operate? What's the context?
Yes.
And then draw back from that, what is best to fit it? They're going, who's got a good idea? And they're basically resourcing the people who've got good ideas. And the scientists love it, of course, because it's keeping them in employment. Like today, you're getting your grant and funding and things like that. And if you move on, one of the more successful, and I think the key point about all these technologies, they all roll forward into post-war developments. I mean, the potential war winners, had they been introduced earlier, or if the war had gone on longer, were the what they call the Walter boats, which are Type 21 and Type 23 inshore submarines. And they are the precursors of quite a lot of conventional submarines in the American, the Russian, and the British Navy afterwards. So essentially what these submarines were going to do is take traditional U-boats like the Type 7s and Type 9s. They're basically submersibles. They have to spend a lot of the time on the surface. And the Type 21, which was an ocean-going 1,200-ton submarine, 6 torpedo tubes, it could basically do 17 knots underwater, which is amazing. Actually faster than most escorts. On the surface, it could do 16 knots. It could go basically for 75 hours at 5 knots submerged. It had a snorkel, not a very good one, but this could have revolutionized underwater warfare. And so they produced probably about 118 of these. 2 of them actually got to sea on a war patrol. One of the COs claimed to have lined up a cruiser, but of course peace had been declared. We don't think that's true. They had a lot of problems. And what we were talking about, the integration of the systems. So the metallurgy, again, wasn't great, so the pressure hull was poor. It had external systems to the pressure hull. So that was very liable to pressure damage and also contact damage. The hydraulic system was an absolute nightmare, but it had a very streamlined hull. And as I said, has tremendous endurance. They could go 15,000 miles without refueling, very silent underwater. And these little coastal ones, the Type 23s, they came in earlier. They actually went out and did war patrols, sank some ships. They lost 7 of those to mines and things like that. But these definitely had the potential to change the war at sea. Alongside that, the Germans introduced acoustic homing torpedoes, which caused a real problem initially when they arrived, because they're not like straight runners. They chase you around the ocean. What we did there was we produced a towed noisemaker called a Foxer that the torpedoes would go after. We still use those today. We used them in the Falklands War to decoy torpedoes, so they're still around. There was an amazing bomb called the Fritz X, and there were a couple of variants of that. That was used from sort of Luftwaffe bombers against shipping. So the Fritz X, for example, was used to sink the Italian battleship Roma and cripple the Italia after the Italians surrendered to the Allies. It then attacked 3 3 cruisers and HMS Warspite at the Salerno landings and severely damaged all of them. So you can see that they're thinking about things that will actually help them tactically. But these are real developments at sea that could have helped them had they had them earlier.
I mean, the Kriegsmarine had success stories alongside the failures we discussed, particularly, for example, the E-boat. I mean, Chris is the expert here, but wouldn't you agree, Chris, that the E-boat was probably superior to the British motor torpedo boat, and devastated some of our preparations for D-Day? Went across the Channel and
slapped in sands,
and hundreds of men were lost.
Just on the E-boat, tell us a bit about the E-boat and
what
made it unique.
They were the E-boats. These are small motor torpedo boats, rather equivalent to our MTBs, but faster and better, and bigger, and better armed, packed to punch, and were it was their rapidity. They appeared out of nowhere, did horrendous damage, and then disappeared again, and that was definitely a plus for the German Navy, that they should have invested more. And of course, Chris has talked about the U-boat success. I would suggest the major success of the Kriegsmarine in the Second World War was their undersea warfare, which nearly lost us the Battle of the Atlantic and could have lost us the war.
Well, now that's a really interesting point. Let's say you had the Type 21 and the Type 23s available throughout the Battle of the Atlantic. I mean, does that fundamentally change things?
Without question. If they are using their 6 torpedo tubes and you've got electrical loading for those, so in the time it takes you manually to load 1 torpedo, you can actually load 6 torpedoes at once. Those reloads in the middle of a convoy would be absolutely critical. The fact that the submarine can actually go underwater faster than your escorts is absolutely critical. They're very silent as well. And the technology itself, as I said, was used subsequently for all diesel-electric submarines. And the Russians in particular, their Romeo and Whiskey classes are based on this. They are actually true submarines, but there were a lot of technical problems. These things kept on breaking down. You couldn't actually rely on them. I mean, the numbers are incredible. I mean, they planned to have 1170 Type 21s. That was the program. They actually produced 118 in the end, and the smaller ones, 980 of them were planned. I mean, that was the program that was put in place from 1943 onwards.
And Nigel, were the Allies not developing anything remotely similar at this point?
If we're talking about on the sea, I don't think nothing that could compete with that. I mean, we did win the war at sea eventually, and we did develop things like the depth charges that wreaked such havoc on the U-boats.
And the hedgehogs, hedgehogs and better sonar and things. I mean, but it would have been a bit of struggle. I mean, the fact of life is most of the kills in World War II took place with mines and aircraft. Now, if they're not on the surface, you're not going to find them. So these boats would have stayed down a lot longer, and you'd have found that the smaller boats, the Type 23s, only had 2 torpedoes, mind you, could have got in quite a lot of places. I mean, D-Day is a nightmare if you have Type 23 submarines around and you don't have...
So you think maybe D-Day doesn't work?
Well, it does, but you're going to take a lot more losses, I would think,
I mean, there was huge fears of D-Day. Churchill feared exactly this, especially after the Slapton Sands debacle, disaster, and the failure of Dieppe, of course. Churchill was quite prepared to countenance the fact that D-Day was going to be a bloody failure, and it wasn't.
I mean, if you had the Type 21 and Type 23 submarines, for instance, Chris, does that also change the way Adolf Hitler approaches the Kriegsmarine? Because, I mean, he never gave it the love that a lot of his admirals thought he should have done.
Yeah, things changed in 1943 because Grand Admiral Raeder resigns and says, look, I can't put up with this anymore. And he retires, mainly because Heydrich, who'd been a naval officer, has been killed in Czechoslovakia, and he feels safe to retire. And Raeder had been instrumental in getting him removed from the Navy. But Dönitz takes over at that point, and Dönitz is committed to the Nazi cause. He did a very good propaganda campaign on himself afterwards and in Nuremberg, but he is a committed Nazi. And if you look at the interchanges between Dönitz and Hitler, it's quite clear that Hitler is favouring him over and above these failing generals. And there are all sorts of instances where Dönitz is invited to lunch afterwards when nobody else is. And of course, Dönitz takes over after Hitler kills himself.
Yes, he does.
And so the idea that the submarines can win the war for Hitler is something that Dönitz is constantly in the Hitler conferences saying to him, we can do this, we can do this.
Is that a...
Actually,
go on, Nigel.
sorry, the personnel on board the U-boats, for example, I met the author Lothar Gunther Buchheim, author of the famous Das Boot, and he said to me, without question, that they thought that they were on board a war-winning weapon, that the U-boats could actually do it. But Hitler famously said that he was a hero on land and a coward at sea. I don't think his primary, because he was an ex-soldier, I don't think his primary interests, sadly for the Germans, for the Kriegsmarine, lay in the Navy, and I think his main interest was in the land and air.
It's interesting because Hitler, whenever you see pictures of him visiting the Kriegsmarine and he's in a boat, he looks decidedly seasick.
Yes.
Yeah,
and in fact, he and Goering were both known for their seasickness.
Yes.
And the Navy called Goering, and he knew about this, the thrower-up in chief. And of course, he resented this immensely from the Navy. But you're right. But the influence of Dönitz from 1943 onwards is quite intense with Hitler, because Hitler's saying, look, you know, the army is failing me.
Yeah.
How can the Navy win this for me? And I think Dönitz, as I said, is actually saying to him, these new boats are going to do it for you.
Just before we get onto the air, is there not a running theme with the Wunderwaffe whereby, had they focused their research and their development a bit more, and, for example, not wasted time trying to develop a warship that is far bigger than anyone needs, and focused on the Type 21s and the Type 23s and getting them online earlier, then actually the entire project would have been far more effective?
I think so. I mean, what they needed really was a Speer, i.e. a super minister who could concentrate resources, knew where to put the resources, like Speer did, as we discussed earlier, that he put the manufacture of the V1s and the V2s literally underground after the Allied bombing raids. If we'd had such a Superman as a minister, as a dictator, dictating German industry, they could have done
I mean,
better than they did.
It's typified with their nuclear program, for example. So
Yes.
all through the 30s, you've got about a dozen parallel programs leading towards nuclear power. That's the first thing. And then somebody says, oh, you know, we could probably use this as a weapon. And that arises about 1938 onwards. So they have a committee. But the problem is, Goering's in charge of the various economic plans. So they have to get Goering on board. Speer then is brought in, and they say, what's the feasibility of doing this? And they say, oh, you know, it's definitely feasible, but probably not before 1947. So they make a decision that actually we need the resources elsewhere. So for once, with a really decisive weapon, they say, we don't want to use our resources. And in fact, Speer authorises the release of 1,500 tons of uranium for what they call solid core ammunition that they want to use in future. And they say, we need to wait for this program down the line. Famous heroes of Telemark, of course, they destroy the heavy water plant in Norway as part of that. But in fact, the Nazis have lost interest because it's not going to be there in time. And so in 1942-3, they say, right, we're going to continue on the back burner with this research, but we're not going to push forward. Too many resources, don't have enough time to bring it in.
Hold that thought.
Hitler's managerial style was to put several people doing the same job, and they were they had this working towards the Führer, as they called it. And I think that caused enormous confusion, not to mention rivalry, because the Nazi paladins all detested each other and were jealous of each other. Goering and Speer, for example, were basically supposed to be in charge of the same industrial productivity job, and they did not like each other, and they clashed, and this obviously affected German effectiveness.
Let's park the nuclear programme for the time being, and let's come back to that, because that is a big what if. Aerial weapons. What were the aerial Wunderwaffe, Nigel?
Well, the weakness of the Luftwaffe, in my opinion, as compared to Britain and France, is that they did not have any heavy bombers. They didn't. So this idea that Britain could have been reduced and forced to surrender by an aerial bombing campaign was nonsense, because the Heinkels and the Junkers did not compare in any way. They didn't have a Lancaster, they didn't have a Liberator or a Fortress, they didn't have that. So that was it was given the job that it couldn't do. It was beyond them.
They had a project called the America Bomber Project, and a series of sort of aircraft were put up for this, and they actually produced a 6-engine bomber that could cross the Atlantic and bomb New York.
Yeah.
That's what it was supposed to be able to do. And quite a lot of these designs conceptually could do it, but they never actually got them into full production at any stage. That was the point. Again, it's down to materials and the ability to actually survive in the everyday war. But you had other heavy transport aircraft, another 6-engine thing that was produced by Messerschmitt that carried essentially about 25,000 pounds and 150 troops. It's a sort of Second World War C-17. But this sort of thing, to give you, again, it's typical of the Nazi mentality. This thing had rotatable gun turrets in its wings. so that's the sort of thing. You had a glider, for example, another Messerschmitt design, which could basically carry 200 troops and 50,000 pounds or 50,000 pounds of stores. I mean, these are huge. Again, we're back to the size issue. So they had the capacity to build these aircraft, but they never focused these designs on what tasks they were supposed to do. They called it the America bomber, but it never got anywhere.
And if they had them, say, during the Battle of Britain,
yes,
do they win the Battle of Britain? Are they that good?
Well, the Battle of Britain, of course, was a fighter. Was fighters against fighters. And I once asked a Battle of Britain veteran who had piloted Spitfires and Hurricanes, what was the greatest fighter aircraft of the Second World War? And much to my surprise, he didn't say either one of those things. He said an Me-109, a Messerschmitt 109 with the German. So that was a tribute to German engineering. But I just think we're getting back to the question of the misuse of scarce resources. The resources were scarce, and those that they did have were largely misused.
We mentioned earlier, Chris, the V1s and the V2s.
Yeah.
Let's just explain exactly what they are.
OK, so the V1 is basically a cruise missile. It's got a warhead of about 850 kilograms. You put enough fuel in it to go the range you want, and you allow for the atmospherics and the wind and things like that. And when it runs out of fuel, it drops out of the sky and detonates. It's not an accurate weapon. That's the key point. You need to focus it on urban areas. And so about 20,000 of them were produced. 10,000 actually used on the Western Front. In terms of the ones that were destroyed, about 1,800 destroyed by aircraft, another 1,500 by anti-aircraft fire, 200 by barrage balloons. But the rest landed in Britain against Paris and in Antwerp and places like that. So essentially a cruise missile, very unsophisticated, no guidance. Now the V2 is something else. Now a ton warhead and essentially a ballistic missile that goes about 220 miles, goes up into the exo-atmosphere, comes down at 3,800 miles an hour. And 5 minutes after launch, it hits its target. But once again, pretty inaccurate. So you need to hit area targets. You can't hit the sort of things you might want. So it's a terror weapon, there's no question about that. And but they cost 10 times the amount of the V1s. So essentially about 3,000 used against targets in the West.
But you say they were a terror weapon. I mean, they certainly did strike terror.
They absolutely did. They killed people, and this we're talking about the end of towards the end of the war in 1944. So they weren't launched until after D-Day, until after Allied troops were fighting in Europe, and the Allies were very worried about them, and which is why they organised a bombing raid on Peenemünde, which is where Werner von Braun and his team were building them, mainly. And then they had their launch sites all over Western Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium and France.
I think it's worth mentioning that Speer and the Germans were very smart underneath the bombing campaign. They dispersed quite a lot of their production. So, for example, the new U-boats were built in sections. The big ones, 9 sections. The smaller ones, 4 sections. And the little ones could actually be transferred between the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Channel by train. So the 4 bits were put on trains and reassembled at the other end. So very smart indeed. And the production really only broke down when obviously the bombing campaign switched from the cities to the railways, the canals, and also the roadways that are actually supporting this logistic network. It's an astonishing feat to actually keep that productivity going.
And the V1s and the V2s, these are what were known as the flying bomb or the doodle bugs?
Well, doodle bug, is the first one. And I think everybody called it a V2. I don't think there's any sort of nickname for that. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there was a V3, which essentially was a rocket propellant-assisted artillery.
So this was still in development at the end of the war?
They were using it. No,
really?
And it was designed actually to fire across the channel at targets in southern England, but a range of 105 miles. So the shell would enter the barrel and then be propelled by rocket fuel being inserted at 4 points of the barrel, and it would be boosted quite significantly at that point.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think the Allies were well aware of the potential of what Wernher von Braun particularly and his team were working on, because at the end of the war, they preserved their lives, captured them, and put them to work on their own program. Famously, of course, Wernher von Braun was the father of the Apollo space program.
Yep.
And is supposedly, I've never been able to stand this up, but he is supposedly the author of the famous quotation, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," which Neil Armstrong said on the moon. But he was definitely the father of that program, and he's caricatured in the great film Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick as the mad German who can't stop saluting, because Wernher von Braun was a keen Nazi. He was, I believe, a member of the SS, and he certainly, like Speer, did not worry about using slave labour to manufacture his weapons when, as Chris said, they were dispersed. And a lot of them were manufactured underground at the Dora concentration camp. And if you go to Dora today and go underground, you can see parts of the rockets still lying around in a rusty state.
And we talked earlier about the nuclear programme.
Yes.
By the end of the war, what do the Allies know about where the Nazis are or are not when it comes to potentially developing an atomic bomb?
They know that the Germans aren't working on it. It's as simple as that. They're worried about the Japanese, actually, oddly enough, because they have a nuclear and a chemical and biological program. But they know that the Germans aren't actually working on it. They're not seeing any installations. They're not seeing any desire to get resources. As I said, the heavy water plant in Norway have been destroyed, and the Germans didn't seem to worry about that. So that probably indicates they were working on isotope transfer, though. They knew that. That was an interesting thing. And quite a lot of the nuclear power programs were continuing as far as the resources allowed. But they knew pretty much that there was never going to be a nuclear weapon in time.
I mean, it was a big, big mistake. And here we come to Nazi ideology, that many of the nuclear scientists who fled to the West, ended up in America working on the Manhattan Project, were Jewish. Were Jewish exiles. So
this is during the 1930s when the program is really starting to
so they shot themselves in the foot there from the outset.
Okay, so we've talked about sea, we've talked about land, we've talked about, are the Germans developing an atomic bomb? What about the aircraft, Chris?
Yeah, well, this is an amazing program. And if you look across the whole spectrum of the concepts that were in play at the time, not all of which came to fruition, almost everything you see in modern technology has its genesis in what the Nazis are doing. Yeah. So you've got vertical takeoff and landing aircraft being proposed. You've got tilt rotor, which means basically you take off in the hover and then you transition forward, just like the V-22 Osprey today. You've got rocket-assisted anti-aircraft missiles, and you've got push-pull aircraft where you've got a propeller on the front, one on the back, and every single sort of configuration we see to say, including the flying wing, that occurred. You've got swept wing aircraft all being produced, and you've got 5 types of helicopter as well. One's an autogyro, to be fair, 4 types of helicopter and an autogyro. But right at the top of the list, of course, is you've got the Me-163, the Comet, which is a single 5-minuter, literally a 5-minute in the air jet aircraft, but also the Me-262. Which is probably the starring weapon, which, if it come in earlier, would have been decisive. And, you know, they produced, 1,400 of these Me-262s. And so they could have actually been decisive. Started off basically as being an air interceptor. I'm afraid Hitler and Goering both said no, we want it to be a fighter bomber. Had significant problems with its metallurgy and its engines, which were very unstable and needed servicing every 5 days or so. So almost every sortie you were having to say, is the engine still okay? Are the engines still okay? But this is an aircraft that does 120 miles an hour, faster than the fastest Allied aircraft, the Mustang. And so significant, and we can talk about the tactics and whether that would have made a difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, Nigel, bring you in on that. I mean, Chris says they could have been decisive. In what way would they have been decisive? How would they have been used in reality?
Well, they were another class. I mean, the jet engine was simply just a huge advance in aviation, in aeronautics, and they would have outpaced any Allied planes. Chris said they were faster than the fastest American fighter, the Mustang. And if they had come in sufficient numbers, the fact that the Germans had lost air superiority before D-Day even, that situation would have been completely reversed and they would have regained air superiority. And who knows what would have happened to the campaign in the West. They could have seen the Allies thrown back into the sea.
So we were saying earlier, you know, does D-Day fail, for example, if you've got the Type 21 and the Type 23s? If you've got them and you've got aerial superiority for the Germans at this point,
question.
Then absolutely D-Day fails.
Yes.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, there we go. That is the real history of why the German wonder weapons weren't able to make a difference. But now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's do what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some what-ifs about the German wunderwaffes, the wonder weapons. Nigel, at what point do they need to start coming online? I mean, you know, by the time you do get the V1s and the V2s and indeed the V3, it is too late. So how early would they need to have come into service to make a decisive difference?
I think they should have had them already, at least in development, in June 1941 when they invaded the Soviet Union. I think that was probably the moment. I mean, up to that point, everything had gone their way. They hadn't needed, in crude terms, these weapons. They even had, in the campaign in France, a lot of their forces were not armoured, were horse-drawn and transport and everything else. They hadn't really needed advanced weaponry. But from June 1941, they sure did.
Chris, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could have left it later. I think you look at the Battle of the Atlantic, if they'd had the U-boats in before Evil May in 1943, it would have made a difference. To tell the truth, you're building up quite a lot of forces for D-Day, North Africa landings and things like that. The presence of those new U-boats, if they'd been fully operational and functioning as they were designed to, then would have played havoc amongst some of these convoys. I mean, the fact you can go faster, twice as fast as some of the convoys underwater, is a real problem. So I think that issue, we saw, as I said, with the Fritz X guided bomb, before we got the jamming organised around that, these things hit the ships and did serious damage to battleships and also to cruisers as well. So you've got a real problem in relation to that. So I think you probably could have got away with it probably early 1943. Transfer to the air. If the ME-262s and the 163s are airborne at that stage, Bomber Command is taking serious losses, as are the US Army Air Force. And so the whole strategic direction of that bombing campaign has to alter at that point.
And are we saying, therefore, that not only is the Nazi war effort strengthened, but maybe the entire tide of the war changes?
Absolutely, because the war, when it came down to it, was a war of resources, and Nazi Germany just did not have the resources to develop these weapons and to win the war that way.
I mean, the one thing I would say is that Germany is running out of trained manpower at this point to service some of these. So they're putting Luftwaffe personnel into U-boats at this stage. They've lost so many. There aren't a lot of ME-262 pilots around either. So if you can get 1,500 of those into service, you've got to train them. And this is a difficult aircraft to fly. Our test pilots after the war said, fantastic performance. I mean, climbing to height in absolutely no time whatsoever, but actually attacking slower moving bombers and even fighters was very difficult. They had to adapt a lot of new routines for coming in a curved approach to be able to take them. In the end, the ME-262 had to be fitted with rockets to actually take out the bombers because it was flying past so fast they couldn't actually engage in a conventional way with a gun sight. Hadn't actually got that sorted out. So there was a training and a manpower issue associated with this. But, you know, the Germans are very inventive, very committed ideologically, and you've got a submariner running the Navy. And Goering, of course, is going to be very happy with this new toy he's got in being able to bring down bombers in particular.
But here's the thing. So if we're saying that the Type 21 and Type 23 submarines potentially helped the Nazis win the Battle of the Atlantic,
Yeah.
the ME-262...
Or not lose it.
Or not lose it. The ME-262 helped maintain aerial dominance in Western Europe, potentially defeating D-Day. So D-Day fails. So the Battle of the Atlantic isn't lost by the Germans. At that point, are we saying, well, the Germans could win World War II?
I think so. I think that is the case. In the end, World War II was lost because the powers that were ranged against Germany just had virtually, in America's case, unlimited resources. So unlimited that they gave a lot of it away to Stalin's Russia to help them fight it. So it was. If you look at the size of Germany and compare it to the size of Russia or the size of the United States, it's quite obvious who was going to win the war.
I think the issue is that it helps him win the war in the West.
Yes,
Yeah.
OK.
I think that's the issue. And of course, the downstream effect of all of this, of course, is the Russians come further. So if they're set up for this two-front war with Germany, I think you're going to see the Western allies probably held up quite significantly by these weapons, particularly if you can get more of the V1s and V2s to actually hit targets you want rather than just countries.
Yes.
And I think you're going to see quite a stall there. So that means the Russians do come further west as a result of that.
So what, in your view, Chris, and then I'll ask this of you, Nigel, as well, is the most important wonder weapon? If you can only have one, is it the submarines?
Well, I'm a naval officer, so of course I want the submarines. I mean, yeah, you're going to interdict that Atlantic bridge quite significantly. But in a war of this nature, this character, war is eternally the same, you're always going to need a combination of weapon systems to be able to coerce an opponent into surrendering. So it's not one of them, I'm afraid, James. You've got to have a combination. I think the 262 and the submarines, and I think some of these guided weapons. I should mention that the Nazis had a thing called the Silver Bird that was a suborbital missile that could go up into the edge of the atmosphere and go all the way to America or into Russia at the end of the war.
Well, this is true, and I mean that could have had huge ramifications. I mean, if you could bomb Broadway, then that is completely transforming the Second World War.
That's what the America bomber was about.
Yeah.
But the Silver Bird, I mean, just give you an idea again of their range of ideas. There was an idea of a sort of a giant mirror they put in space that would be used as a laser weapon.
Star Wars, we're talking.
They actually talked about X-ray beam weapons. So directed energy was something they were thinking about at the time. So there's no limit to the innovation that this war caused in terms of German inventiveness.
Nigel,
you asked what would be the weapon I would choose. What would be the one? I think in terms of the future development of warfare and indeed of space exploration, I would have to go for the V2.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the real wonder weapon was the atomic bomb, which they failed to actually develop. And so that's what loses the war. Essentially for it stops Japan having to carry on. We've exposed the myth that the atomic bombs led to the surrender of Japan. Of course, it was the entry of the Soviet Union into the war that caused that. But at the end of the day, once the atomic weapons have been exploded, who's going to fight against the Allies at that point?
But maybe what the Nazis should have been doing, I mean, we've already spoken about how, with a lot of the wonder weapons program, they were, wasting resources on weapons that were just, obsolete. You don't need an enormous warship bigger than anyone ever built. You should have focused more on the Type 21 and the Type 23, etc. But maybe they should have focused on an atomic program.
Well, as things have turned out, they certainly should have done. But then the question would be, where would they drop it? Where would they drop it? Would they drop it on London? Would they develop one of Chris's super planes to fly across the Atlantic and drop it on Broadway? Or would they wipe out Moscow?
I think the key issue here is, they didn't develop the program. It didn't even start really. So we had to discount it. But I think the real issue is, what would the Germans have done if they knew the Manhattan Project was underway? Would they have gone, we get it. They probably wouldn't have done, because even Stalin wasn't bothered about it until one was exploded. When he was told, at Potsdam by Truman, we've actually got, an atomic bomb, he went, oh, okay. And of course, he really got it when it was exploded at Hiroshima. So I wonder what the effect on German resistance, for example, the need to hold out would have been if they'd known about the Manhattan Project early.
Nigel, in terms of Germany winning the war or losing the war,
Yes.
is the moral of the story here that maybe equipment can only take you so far and that strategic decision-making ultimately is the decisive factor?
I think the possession of resources is the decisive factor, because the German morale was sky high. They were pretty much man and boy were sure that they were going to win the war up to very, very late in the day, up to Stalingrad or even a little bit later.
And is that just because of the propaganda they're being fed by Goebbels about, for example, the wonder weapons? Wait until we have these weapons. They will turn the tide of the war for us.
Well, no, because Goebbels tended to start talking about that only when the Germans had started to lose the war. He didn't talk about that. And it was in a way a revenge for the Allied success in laying waste to German cities. So I think, yes, that then became the forlorn hope of Germany, that we'll turn the tide, but the tide had already turned against them.
I think the main problem is it's rather like the Nazi political military structure is rather like some of this technology. There are too many moving parts.
Yes.
And they're all moving in different directions in many ways. And they never, ever close down that issue. Something Nigel mentioned earlier, this constant infighting between the various sort of fiefdoms. You can see it in almost all the literature. You can see that Hitler is giving people the same job across a wide spectrum. They're all coming back and saying, well, this is my idea. And they run with all of them. Instead of actually saying, here's the best one, let's go with that. Again, if you look at the aircraft program, there are huge numbers of initiatives and programs in which they waste resources. It's all fascinating, this vertical takeoff stuff, the tilt rotor. I mean, amazing in terms of the way we look back at it now, but it does dilute the effort. They don't focus. Again, I get back to my point. It's all very well having capabilities, but if you don't conceptualise their use, then they just become toys.
And there's a catch-22. I mean, as you were saying about the importance of resources, Nigel, the more you focus your resources, even on weapons that may end up being absolutely decisive, the more you're denuding your wider war efforts.
Quite, yes. We talk about these wonder weapons, but we're in danger, I think, of forgetting that wars are won by boots on the ground, by the good old-fashioned infantrymen or the crews of a ship at sea or a submarine at sea, and that however good these wonder weapons were, not one single one of them, I think, could have won the war.
Not one on its own.
Not one on its own. As Chris said before, they needed to be integrated into systems.
So it's the ME-232 with the Type 21s, 262 with the Type 21s and the Type 23s. Then you get a decisive
and some
impact.
of the bombers. And if you take some of your long-range bombers out into the Atlantic, for example, you're bombing convoys and ships and things. It's an integrated capability. There's no question about that.
So, final thought from each of you. Very often the wunderwaffe have been written up as the great what-if of the Second World War from the Nazi perspective. How close in reality do you think the wonder weapons were to winning the war for Germany?
I think unless they had a super weapon that could destroy at a stroke the capital cities and the war-making capacity of the Allies, there was never a chance that the Germans would win the war after June 1941, in my view.
Chris?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I think the pendulum is swinging that way. I believe if they focused their programs, got an integrated campaign across all three, maybe even four with the edge of space environments, they might have actually been able to force a peace earlier, to tell you the truth. I think that would have been possible. I think Nigel's point's really interesting, is wars are not normally won by the leading technologies because they're too new, they're not integrated. They're won by the traditional stuff. And while the Allies were pumping out loads of traditional ships, aircraft and armoured vehicles, they were diluting their effort in some of this
crazy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, as ever, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. And I think what we can say is that the German Wunderwaffe project, the wonder weapons, were indeed an incredible showcase of Nazi innovation at the time, and we saw incredible scientists like Wernher von Braun and Heisenberg working on it, but it was potentially not focused enough as a project. You had them developing warships that were far bigger than could ever be practical. And had they focused it more, and had some of the key wonder weapons been available earlier, then potentially yes, the Second World War could have turned out very differently. If you had the Type 21 and 23 submarines, for instance, available earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic could have been won by the Nazis, or at the very least not lost decisively by the Nazis. The air power that potentially could have come from the Me-262s could have been significant in defeating the Allied landings in Normandy. So does D-Day fail if you combine it with the naval power of the Type 21 and the Type 23s? What about the V1s and the V2s, and of course the V3s? What if they had been available earlier in the war? Does that fundamentally alter the entire conflict? And then, of course, as with many World War II counterfactuals, there's always the big if of what if the Nazis had an equivalent of the Manhattan Project available to use at the end of the conflict? Do they end up bombing Moscow, London, New York City? We'll never know, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Nigel Jones and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you soon. Goodbye.